All right. This, that, and the other thing. Looks like most of the technology bits are doing what they're supposed to. Just check my settings here real quick. Just wanted to make sure the sound was working because I hadn't heard anything yet. Hopefully you can all hear me through my microphone. It looks like it's registering. Okay. Every now and then when I change things, I have to make sure that it works for the next time I load something up. All right, let's get this. I think we can do one chunk bigger. Come on, there we go. Yeah, that's a little better, especially for people on small screens. All right, well, it is 12:01, time to get down to work and to begin discussing Parashat Ki Tisa, one of the most splendid parshiot in the entire Torah, and one that has so many different nooks and crannies, pun intended. Keep reading and you'll figure out what I'm talking about. But that's not what we're going to be doing today. Instead, we're going to look at the aftermath of the golden calf incident. Just a quick reminder of the setup. God has brought the Israelites to Har Sinai, to Mount Sinai. They have heard the theophany, that's the fancy philosophy word for heard the speech of God, oftentimes referred to as the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. And now Moses has gone up the mountain to receive the more formal statement of the covenant, and he has been gone 40 days. The people grow restless. They press Aaron. They end up making a golden calf and begin worshiping it. Now, it's unclear precisely how many people participated in each step of this process. It's unclear exactly what they did when they were worshiping. It's even unclear what they thought they were accomplishing. However, when Moses comes down, as God explains to him that he must because the people have become rebellious, he is less than pleased, leading to the famous breaking of the tablets that he has come down with. Now, that has always been the focal point of artwork or of retellings of the story. But there is an important next part of the aftermath of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, and that's where we are going to focus on. So we're going to pick up on chapter 32, verse 19, to see one of the main immediate consequences of this incident. All right, let's get things lined up. Come on. There we go. Come on. Why does the mouse never quite put things? That's where I want it. Okay. And it was when he neared the camp and saw the calf and the dancing that Moshe's anger flared up. He threw the tablets from his hands and smashed them on the mountain. Again, that is often the focal point of descriptions of this incident. But we continue. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it up until it was thin powder and strewed it on the surface of the water and made the children of Israel drink it. So this grinding and throwing of the gold upon water and then forcing people to drink it, I should point out, is biologically inconsequential. In fact, there are silly gourmet dishes that have made the rounds on social media of people putting gold flakes or gold leaf on food and eating it. Gold is apparently biologically neutral for the average person, so it's not harmful. It's just wasteful. In this particular case, however, it seems to be echoing the later usage of something strewn upon water and then forced to drink, which is, of course, the Sota ritual in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, for the suspected adulteress. This seems to be quite likely focused on discovering the depth of people's betrayal and also the complete and utter removal of the symbol of the golden calf. After all, if they had just buried it or even just destroyed it, then it would always be possible for it to be dug up or for the remnants to be gathered again and reconstituted. There is no second chance for the golden calf after this form of destruction. Verse 21, then Moses said to Aharon, what did this people do to you that you have brought upon it such a great sin? Actually, excuse me. Actually quite a generous question that Moses is asking here, because obviously he's going to be angry at Aaron for this happening, because Aaron was sort of in charge when he was gone, but he is asking it in a way where he is implying that you must have been forced to do this. Aaron responds, let not the Lord's anger flare up. And here he is talking about Moses as the Lord. That's why in the English it's not capitalized. In Hebrew, of course, we don't get such useful things as capital letters to tell us when it's God or a mortal. But by context, it seems quite clear. Let not my Lord's anger flare up. You yourself know this people, how set on evil it is. So he is, throwing the people under the bus. They said to me, make us a God who will go before us. For this Moshe, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him, because he's been gone for 40 days. So I said to them, who has gold? They broke it off and gave it to me. I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Again, minimizing the idea that he deliberately made the calf. Moshe saw the people, that it had gotten loose from Aaron, for Aaron had let it loose for whispering among their foes. All right. This verse is challenging. I'm going to show you one of the great features of Sefaria, whereas if you click on a verse, you can then come over to the translations button, and it will offer you multiple translations from different versions. So here we have the Fox translation that I just read, but you can also read from the JPS translation. Moses saw that the people were out of control, which, gotten loose, out of control, that's quite similar, since Aaron had let them out of control, so that they were a menace to any who might oppose them. All right, so here we see one of the primary differences in interpretation is whether or not this second clause is describing the danger the Israelites presented to others, which would exonerate Aaron, or whether the danger their actions have created problems from their enemies, meaning from those that might menace the Israelites. If we look through the other translations, we can try and see if there's a consensus. And when Moses saw that the people were in disorder, for Aaron had made them disorderly, to the scandal of their enemies. And again, here we have to realize that scandal in this sense is not saying that the enemies are in a scandal. It is the enemies are scandalized, meaning they are shocked at the behavior of the Israelites. Likewise, Mitsuda, which is known for taking the Rashi commentary and blending it in. Moshe saw the bad traits of the people, for they were now exposed, for Aaron had allowed them to be exposed, and now they would be disgraced among their adversaries. As we'll see from some of our commentaries on this verse, there are many that argue that the issue here wasn't that they had just done something wrong, but that this was inviting challenge from outside. You'll notice as well that this translation is slightly exonerating Aaron by saying that he had simply allowed them to expose their own problems. All right, so that's just a little digression trying to show you how to use Sefaria to help your own personal study as well. Sometimes when we come across verses, especially any that you see in some of the translations with asterisks or footnotes, recognize that there may be more than one way to render that in English, and it can have significant difference. But we'll come back to this idea of what was really the problem when we get to our commentaries in depth. But we must continue first. So Moshe took up a stand at the gate of the camp and said, whoever is for Adonai, to me. And there gathered to him all the sons of Levi. So remember, Moshe is a Levite. That is to say, he is a child of the tribe of Levi. And therefore, it is not surprising that they would flock to him. And then he said to them, thus says Adonai, the God of Israel, put every man his sword on his thigh, proceed and go back and forth from the gate to gate in the camp, and kill every man his brother, every man his neighbor, every man his relative. All right. This sounds a little egregious, disproportionate, to use the modern terminology. Moses seems to be implying, at a very superficial level, that the Levites are meant to go as zealot soldiers and murder everyone. Who are they attacking? Who are they killing? Because we we can't imagine it to mean everybody that is in the camp, because then everybody would be dead and there would only be Levites left. But obviously that is not what happens. And obviously that is not what Moses ever wanted to happen, because we only have to go back a couple pages and find him arguing with God to allow the people as a nation to survive. So we have to look for some other interpretation. We are also struck when we look at this verse by that everybody is told to kill their brothers. Well, if I am a Levite, then my ach, my brother, is going to be another Levite. So I thought the Levites were the good guys. So this is, again, on a superficial level, a little challenging. We're going to uncover a little bit more about this, but I should also point out that that term ach in general, from a very, very simple linguistics standpoint, can just mean your fellow. It doesn't have to be a biological brother in the literal sense, the same way that even in modern English, we might call someone a brother, even if we share no genetic relation, no relatives at all. But we will find a different explanation and some more things to think about when we get to our commentary. The sons of Levi did according to Moshe's words, and there fell of the people on that day some 3,000 men. Aha. Okay. So we know that they didn't kill everyone, because there's only 3,000 dead, which is still a horrific amount of people being killed, but it is not nearly the totality of the population. This also is going to make us scratch our head and say, well, then how many people were actually involved in the golden calf? Certainly in the movie and artistic representations, it's everybody who is participating except for the Levites. But here we're seeing that there were a tiny percentage, according to the numbers that are used throughout Exodus, of people actually involved. That should make us stop and reflect that perhaps this was not as grievous as possible, or perhaps there is still much that is very problematic, even with a smaller proportion that are actually being worthy of the death penalty. More on that in our commentary. Moshe said, be mandated, meaning like be committed to Adonai today, even though it be every man at the cost of his son, at the cost of his brother, to bestow blessing upon you today. So he is saying that we have to be vigorous here. We have to be completely dedicated to Adonai, to fulfill what is being asked, even though it is going to be so painful, even though it is going to be so personally costly, because we are in danger of losing the entire relationship right here at the beginning. Remembering, as I mentioned, that a few pages back, God had floated the idea of wiping out the nation as a whole and starting over with Moshe from scratch. So Moshe is taking this very seriously. He sees the nation hanging by a thread, and he is explaining that it is going to take all of their focus and dedication, despite the sacrifices that will be made in order to secure a future for the nation. Okay, that's our text for today. Obviously, the text goes on, but that's the part we're going to focus on. Before we dive in, as always, are there any questions? Okay, then let's take a look at our commentaries. I think I can get, yeah, that's actually, let's back up one, because otherwise it's going to be a very awkward size when we get to the longer texts. Okay, so let's begin with that question of who are these sons of the Levi and who are they killing? So first, we look at Rashi, always a good place to start. So when it refers to all the sons of Levi's, it means all the sons. Now, and Rashi is pointing out that this particular passage, when it says all the sons of Levi, really does mean all of the Levite sons, that it is not just a portion of them. Now, that may seem obvious, and if it does, that's perhaps because you have been thinking that every word in the Torah means what you think it means from the first read. Rashi is displaying here and channeling our tradition that that's not always the case. Sometimes all the land can mean all of a region. Sometimes it can mean all of a country. Sometimes it can mean all the world. All of the sons, likewise, could mean different groups. But in this passage, it does mean all of them. Now, from this, we may gather that all the tribe of Levi remained worthy. And Rashi is pointing out that the reason this is important is because it gives a strong indication that the Levites were not involved in the golden calf incident. Now, there's a little bit of a wrinkle there, of course, because Aaron certainly was involved, even though we wouldn't say that he was part of the worship of the golden calf. But with regards to the term worthy here, it means that they are not going to be subjected to the worst penalties that are about to be dished out. Now we get to our friendly word, his brother. What does that mean? Says Rashi, well, channeling the Talmud, from the same mother, but from a different father, who was therefore an ordinary Israelite and not a Levite. So the Talmud points out that the only way you can have a brother of a Levite that isn't a Levite would be if they shared the same mother, but shared a different father. As tribal affiliation is passed father to son, it is perfectly possible for two different men to have been married to the same woman at different times, and the first being a Levite would produce a Levi offspring, and the second being from any other tribe would produce what is known as a standard Israelite offspring. At this time, whether it might be Benjamite, Yehudite, or whatever. So indeed, they were not just attacking those that were of different tribal affiliation. They were put in a position where they did have to attack their own relatives. Now, is this a exercise in logical apologetics of trying to make it reconcile with our literal understanding of how could they kill brothers if their brothers were all Levites? No. What Rashi is really trying to do here is to make sure that we do not diminish the tragedy, the catastrophe, the horrible problem that is going on here, that in fact these Levites really are being put in a position where they will have to, at least some of them, kill their actual brothers, not merely those affiliated with them through the nation, but the people that they have called brother their whole life. And that is the depth of the danger and problem, the emergency that is at hand. And it is, in the eyes of Rashi and our tradition, to their credit that since they understood the danger, they were willing to act in this way. We're going to come back to that danger and what it meant in a little bit. Now, Chizkuni continues by drawing attention to the fact that it doesn't seem that God ever actually said to do this. If you go back a few verses, where it's sorry, not back a few verses, all right, but it says that, be mandated with Adonai here. Well, that's fine and dandy, but where did God tell us to do this whole murder our brothers thing? Especially when we get back to verse 25, where he says, Ko Amar, thus actually said God, but we never got God saying that in any of the prior verses. God never said, strap on your sword and go out and fight. So how can Moses make that claim? Did he have a secret conversation where God gave these orders? No. In Exodus 22:19, it says specifically, whoever sacrifices to a god, meaning an idol, and not our God, shall be prescribed. This is back in Parashat Mishpatim. Now, that phrase prescribed is I like to call it one of those unhelpful English words, where it looks like it's translating Hebrew for you, but really it's not giving you any new information, because chances are you don't use that word in regular English either, and only see it come up in discussions of Jewish topics. It is the translation here of the word cherem, and cherem is a word that is hard to translate. At different times, it can be similar to to excommunication, where we are driving out someone from the community or putting them under a ban of ostracization until they have come into the court order and obeyed the orders of the court. This can be used, for example, as a way of compelling a husband to give a divorce to his wife when he has been refusing to do so. So that can mean that can be that type of excommunication, recognizing as well that Judaism doesn't have excommunication denying you access to heaven. So it's different in that way. It is more the literal ex communa. You are pushed out of the community, at least for a temporary time. But cherem can also mean to put something beyond reach, meaning that it is not something that you will ever benefit from. For example, when the Israelites are commanded during the reign of King Saul to destroy the Amalekites, their property is under cherem. Their property is proscribed, meaning that you're not allowed to take any of their property as loot, which of course Saul and the soldiers do, which is why he ends up losing his kingship. But the idea there is that something is now not accessible, not touchable, not usable by the people. And in this particular case, it's using a third, well, 2.5 version of definition, which is something that is to be not only not used, but in fact destroyed so that it cannot be used. In the same way that the golden calf was destroyed, burnt, ground up, and completely obliterated, so too, those who are committing this act of idolatry will be obliterated. And Chizkuni is bringing that as proof that God had already made this very clear. We'd already been told not to commit these sins, and that if we did, it should be dealt with in this direct of a manner, with the sword in each hand. All right. Moving on, Ibn Ezra says, Moses referred to the Lord specifically as the God of Israel, because those who worshiped the calf thought that the Lord was to be identified with the calf. Again, this is an interesting phrase that comes from verse 27, where he says, "Thus says Adonai, Elohei Yisrael, the God of Israel." That God of Israel phrase feels very superfluous, but of course the Torah has no superfluous words. So what is it adding? Why not simply say, Ho Amar Adonai, thus says Adonai, and then move on? He's arguing that one of the ideas that the golden calf worshippers had in mind was that the golden calf they made was not a substitute, not a new God, but that it was the same God that had taken them out of Egypt, that it was Adonai. And in this way, when Moses is saying, this is what God, the actual God of Israel, not the calf, not whatever else you imagine may be the God of Israel, but the real God, which doesn't get represented in an idol, this God has said, and then continuing with the declaration. So it is a way of highlighting the fundamental flaw of the golden calf worshippers, that they had transferred their devotion from Adonai as this non-corporeal being to the calf, this idolatrous object. But we, of course, know that Adonai, in the pure sense, is the true God of Israel. Okay. Now, what do we make of this problem of a verse of the disgrace among those who would rise up against them, of set against each other as enemies, that complicated verse that we looked at all those other translations for? Well, as you can imagine, our different commentators have had things to say. So let's begin with Tur HaAruch as he tries to unravel this. His translation the translation of his commentary to this parasha uses the following translation of the Torah. Yeah, that makes sense. As a disgrace among those who would rise up against them. Even the portion of the people whose intentions were perfectly innocent will become the pretext for others to point at the disgraceful conduct of the Jewish people for all future generations. Okay, let's make sure we got his basic concept before we get into the implications of it. So he is saying that all of them, meaning all of us, meaning all of the Israelites, have been disgraced by this behavior, even though there is only going to be, in quotes only, 3,000 people murdered because of this. The fact remains that the entire Jewish people are going to be stigmatized in the eyes of the rest of the world because of this incident. Now, does that mean that they deserve it? No. As you can see from his wording, it is a pretext for others that this is not a legitimate complaint, but nonetheless, the people who were involved in this either innocently, meaning they thought it really was God because they didn't know much better because they had been so used to Egyptian belief, or the people who didn't participate at all, or the people but just stood by, or the people who participated but had for one reason or another still felt they had innocent intentions, that this is creating a lasting damage to the nation. As he says, the historians would conclude that all the Jews had been of one mind at that time. The accusations labeled against all the people on that account would give the adversary a valuable tool to use against the Jews. The Jewish people had forfeited their image of being a unique and spiritually superior people, and they would henceforth be considered in the eyes of the nations as of very small stature. All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. I love the brevity of our commentaries, but sometimes it leaves a lot to be explained. So that first phrase, that it would be concluded that we were all of one mind, well, if something took place within a large nation, a large gathering of people, and no one stopped it, then the assumption has to be that at the bare minimum, the majority of the people were willing participants. If one person is in the corner of the room setting fire to the building, and there are 100 other people in the room, and they don't stop him from setting fire in the building, then you have to assume that the other 100 people were okay with the fire being on, with the building being on fire. It does make a great deal of sense. Now, we can understand that for individuals at a different time, such as Aaron, but others as well, including the Levites who were still around, even if they had remained aloof, that's not exactly a fair description. They might have been afraid of the repercussions, that person setting the fire might have had other ways of threatening them. They might have been doing it secretly, but nonetheless, in hindsight, it does become easy to blame the entire nation for the crime of a small group if the entire nation somehow didn't stop that group from doing it. Likewise, this type of accusation then would be useful by Hasatan, the adversary, also called Satan in English, but of course not meaning what Satan means in the minds of most other faiths or pop culture, meaning that this would always be a card that could be pulled out and said, aha, remember when you guys did the golden calf? Remember when you stumbled in idolatry, as a way of trying to encourage harsher punishments against the Jewish people. I mean, after all, if we had fallen like this, and we should now definitely know better because of the tragedies that it creates, then when we stumble in the future, this can be added to the accounting again and again as a gift that keeps on giving to those to that force that wants to hold us to strict justice. And of course, most damning is the fact that the Jewish people had here at this moment an opportunity of presenting themselves to the world as truly an Am Kodesh, a holy people that had a connection to God that was unlike anything else recorded at the time, that would allow them to be an Or LaGoyim, a light to the nations, and truly have a unique destiny. And a lot of that got broken. Not wiped away. Obviously, the Jewish people still have a unique destiny and still have an important role to play. But think of where the status could have been had this not happened. think of the spiritual heights that might have been achieved if this stumbling had not happened so early in the relationship with Adonai. And we have to recognize that that has weakened our standing in the eyes of other nations. And we're just, one more nation doing the same thing that other nations do, worshiping idols in this case. And as such, we should not be given any greater consideration, understanding, or respect than anyone else. It's very, very hard to build up a good reputation. It is very easy to lose it. Okay, Sforno considers this in much the same way. Israel's enemies would say about them that they had breached their covenant with the Lord, and that there was not a single one among them who was a good person, and that they did not even heed the instructions of their prophets. I mean, Moses himself had just told them, don't worship idols, and here they are. Even though only a small minority had ganged up on Aaron, only 3,000 who were put to death, the entire people's reputation would now be dragged through the mud. So Sforno, perhaps a little bit more evocatively, is saying much the same as Tor HaAruch, that this has taken and given our enemies a cudgel against us. Even though it was a minority of our people behaving badly, it makes the rest of us not just look bad, but subject to that type of attack. And that is something that is very hard to recover from. And Malbim will bring us to this idea then of, since this was so severe, since this was so dangerous, but since there was a minority of people involved, how do we understand the going from gate to gate, the attacking of the Levites? Well, each tribe had its own court at the entrance to its encampment to judge its own members. As I have mentioned numerous times, the gate was the entryway to a town or a village in the ancient world, and it was usually in that structure where public affairs would be discussed. The most famous and clear example of this in Tanakh is, of course, in the story of Ruth, where they go, Boaz takes her to the gate of the town so that they can settle the issue of her status once and for all, vis-a-vis the redemption. So that means that if each tribe had its own place in the encampment, which we know it did, it would have had an entrance to its encampment, and that entrance would have served that purpose. So we're talking about a place of judgment. We're not just talking about a door. Moshe dispatched the Levites to see that the sentences of these courts were carried out. So Malbim is in some ways softening their job, meaning that the Levites were not going around just stabbing people. They were going around ensuring that those who were truly guilty would actually be punished, meaning even his brother, that the members of each family were responsible for carrying out the sentences against their brethren, because they would be the first to suffer if they were not punished. In keeping with the verse, I shall set my wrath against that man and his family, taken from Leviticus. So what Malbim is saying here is that that phrase, against his brother, is not exactly what Rashi was saying, that it was the half-brothers of some of the Levites, but instead that it was brother against brother inside of each of the family clans. And that was because the people recognized that what their brothers had done was so beyond the pale that it needed to be excised, prescribed, put under cherem, for the good of the family and for the entire nation. So it wasn't only the Levites that were zealous, it was instead all of the people that were zealous, well, all of the good people that were zealous, even if they had been complacent prior to this point. And the Levites were there as a backup squad of reliable troops that would support the clan's unfortunate retribution against those that had sinned so gravely. All right, so that's a look at some of the ways to understand this section. Sorry, just had to get a little bit of the tea before it went cold. But it doesn't answer what may be one of the most burning questions in your hearts. At least it's one of mine. which is, but how can they have trials about this? And are the executions just being done summarily? Yes, perhaps I understand the desperate need of this moment, that this was a crisis situation. The nation was hanging by a thread. But are we just allowed to execute people we think deserve it? Isn't there a process for capital punishment? And an armed group of roaming soldiers doesn't exactly seem like the process that the Torah describes. So, as you can imagine, we're not the only ones who have had that question. So we're going to pick up here and actually till the end of our class with a commentary from Ramban, that's Nachmanides, who is analyzing not only the discussion of some of our commentaries, but most importantly, discussion from the Talmud. So he's going to walk us through this, and well, we'll see what he has to say. Since there were many worshippers of the calf, and they could not have all been brought to the court, therefore Moses commanded all the sons of Levi to put on their swords in a similar way to which our rabbis have said in Sanhedrin 45b, that if you cannot administer to the guilty the specific kind of death mentioned for his case, you may execute him by any means that you can. All right, now, obviously, Sanhedrin is a much more complicated discussion, but the takeaway that Ramban is focusing on is that there are sometimes situations where carrying out the death penalty according to the correct procedure, meaning the correct one of the four styles of execution and the correct usage of that execution simply can't be done. But that doesn't mean the guilty person gets off. That under certain circumstances, you can execute them in some other manner than as was officially prescribed. And that's what's happening here. Now, does that mean that they were given a trial and then there was just the quick executions by sword rather than another methodology? Or did we skip the trial altogether? Well, Ramban continues. Now, this procedure was a decision only for an emergency in order to sanctify God's name, since those who worshipped the calf had not been forewarned of the death penalty, for who had warned them beforehand. All right, so Ramban is bringing in a very important point. He's saying, look, this couldn't have been an actual normal proper death penalty case times 3,000, because that procedure was not really possible to be followed. That is to say, you would normally need two witnesses that would warn somebody that the deed they are about to perform will incur the death penalty. The person has to give an acknowledgement that they both heard and understand what you have said. And then and only then, when they commit the act despite that, are they subject to the death penalty. That's one of the reasons why the actual use of the death penalty is so rare in Jewish law. Ramban is saying that couldn't have happened. That he's like basically saying with some incredulity, there's no way that you had 6,000 different witnesses, or two for every one of the 3,000 that were executed, that actually went up and said, hey, Bob, if you actually worship that calf, you are going to be executed because it is a sin. And then Bob went, yeah, I know it, and I'm going to worship the calf anyway. That does not seem like anything that fits within our narrative. That people may have seen that they were doing it. They may have even not wanted them to do it, but given the description from Aaron of the feeling, the attitude, the danger in the camp at the time, it feels like that no one was wandering around giving these types of warnings. Thus, we have to conclude, since there were actual executions, that this must have been special circumstances. This was absolutely an emergency situation. This is not something to use as a recurring precedent, but was done only because of the nation hanging by a thread, as he puts it, sanctifying God's name, meaning to ensure that that holiness between us and God would be able to continue and not be wiped away. Okay. Now, in the opinion of the sage who says, back in Yoma 66b, that if there were witnesses to the act of idolatry and forewarning of the penalty, the offender's death was by hand of man, as Rashi wrote, actually in verse 20. Then we shall interpret the meaning of the verse to be that Moses commanded the sons of Levi to put on their swords and take hold of the offenders by force and bring them to the court before Moses or before the Sanhedrin. Now, what he's basically saying here is that in Yoma there is a machloket, there is a debate about whether or not there was warning and witnesses or not. In the opinion of those in that passage that thought there was a warning and witness, then we can still interpret the text to mean, or we can still interpret the text to fit with that. It's a bit more of a stretch, but it works, because then you just say, okay, what the Levites were doing was not walking around executing people. They were walking around as the sheriffs. And it was their job to grab the offenders, the accused, and drag them to the court and force them to see what was going to be brought against them. And in that case, those who were found to have worshipped the calf in the presence of witnesses and with forewarning were then put to death by stoning, as is the punishment for those who worship idols. Or perhaps their death was by the sword, as is the punishment for a whole city gone astray, from Deuteronomy 13. So it does work that the Levites were strapping on their swords, not as executioners, but as sheriffs, and that people were not being stabbed, which is not the typical method of punishing an idolater, but instead that people were being stoned. And if they were being stabbed, it was only after the proper trial in any case. Thus, all the sons of Levi remained loyal to God, and it was they who had warned the people not to worship the calf or sacrifice to it, seeing that Aaron had only commanded to hold a feast to the Eternal alone, as I have explained in one of his other commentaries. So if we read Aaron's words very generously, he didn't ever say worship, he just said, let's have a party, and others decided to do the worshiping at that party. So he was sort of compromising to avoid the people's anger, but never actually encouraging the worship. It's a generous read for Aaron. However, the correct only one word at a time. The correct interpretation is in accordance with the opinion of the sage who says, again, we're back in Yoma 66, those who slaughtered or burnt the sacrificial portions to the calf were punished by the sword. Even though such an offense makes the offender liable to stoning according to Torah law, like we just read, but since the law of the 4 kinds of death had not been declared yet, the offenders were treated under the law of the sons of Noah, B'nai Noach, to whom a form of punishment is applicable. So ultimately, Ramban says, yeah, there is an opinion in the Talmud that this was a perfectly normal sheriff operation, rounding up the suspects, giving them the trial, and only after that doing an execution, and we would have had enough witnesses out of the Levites. But Ramban doesn't actually agree with that opinion. He is disagreeing with that Amora and saying, no, actually, I agree with the first guy I mentioned. This was an emergency situation, and they were acting extrajudiciously. Not that this is a precedent we should follow, but at the time, this is what was believed was correct. And the fact that they were using swords rather than stones, well, that's because they didn't even need to use stones, because the laws of exactly how to execute an idol worshiper had not been properly established yet. Instead, we were still operating under the general rules of humanity, B'nai Noach, the children of Noah, which allowed for execution in other ways. Now, in addition to those that actually sacrificed, that actually made offerings to the calves, which then those people were guilty of a capital crime, those who embraced and kissed it, meaning showed affection and support, but didn't actually officially worship through a sacrificial system, they were punished with death by the hand of heaven, what we know as karet, meaning that, yes, they were guilty of a crime that will take their life without proper tshuva and repentance, but they were not executed by the court. They were not executed at the hands of humans. And then those who merely rejoiced in their heart were afflicted with dropsy, basically that they were made ill from this. So we have three different layers of those that were relating to the calf positively. We had those that actually sacrificed, and they were executed by the court in one manner or another. There were those who loved it, meaning showing it affection and demonstrated actual willingness to serve, but didn't get around to doing the actual sacrifices. They are liable to karet, death at the hand of heavens, but not death at the hand of the court. And then those who privately were like, yay, idols. Well, they were not even going to be executed by heaven. Certainly were not going to be executed by the court, as our courts do not punish mere thoughts. However, they do suffer with a plague, as we see later on in the Torah portion. We stopped reading before that plague hit. That was affecting those that had in their hearts been longing for this idol, but had not actually worshipped it. Now, and all of this is mentioned in Yoma. Thus, Ramban summarizes, it was all a decision under the circumstances of emergency, because embracing or kissing an idol does not make one liable to death by the hand of heaven in all future generations, meaning that even we can recognize even more so that this was a special circumstance, not just because of the extrajudicial nature of the executions that he thinks were taking place. Remember, he sides with the sage that thinks that it was extrajudicial execution rather than the other sage that said that it is more like a sheriff roundup. He says, but even on top of that, the fact that other people are being hurt by their affections for the idol shows that this was a unique time and a unique action for that time, because the halacha in general, for all future generations, all the way up to our own, is that even somebody who wants to worship an idol, even somebody who kisses an idol with affection, is not actually liable to death by the hand of heaven. Definitely, they are not liable to death at the hand of the court. So we have very good evidence that this was a special set of circumstances, a very special moment. And as such, we should not read what they did as permission to execute other people in like manners in the future. Instead, just as we begin to sort of wrap this up, I think where we look at this this action and the aftermath of the golden calf, we really need to focus on the fact that this was a pivotal point in our nation's history, a point unlike any others we've had. I know it is always tempting to claim that we are in a pivotal moment of our existence. We must act now with disregard for the law, unlike the way we normally do, because right now we are standing on the precipice of disaster. But when you look at the actual moment of disaster here, when you look at God threatening to wipe out the entire nation and start again with Moses, that's a different level of threat than any other threat that we have faced afterwards. Even the destructions of the first and second temple and many of the other catastrophes that we have had do not reach the same level of potential threat. And thus, when people use this type of model as being an example for our own dangerous emergency situation, I am inherently skeptical that we do not get to just label something as an emergency and suspend the normal practices of halakha just because we think it's an emergency situation. If we did that, we would in fact be giving license to every group to believe that it was an emergency, and halakha, the rules of Torah, would become meaningless. Because when would we not feel that we were in trouble? When have we not felt that we were in trouble? And yet we do not replicate the behavior that we're seeing here. And for different times during the Torah's discussion, there are certain things that were unique to that generation and that point in time. And as much as we will use the rest of the Torah as precedent for our own lives, sometimes we learn precedent of what we don't get to do ever again. And this is one of those. Turning on each other and slaying those that had done something which under normal circumstances would not earn the death penalty, or earn the penalty without a proper trial. That is not something that we repeat. And if we do repeat it, we do so at our own peril. Any other questions before we wrap it up for today? Don't see any on the YouTube channel. And I don't see anybody asking on Zoom. So we will go ahead and wrap it up. Take care, everyone. As always, keep reading and studying. And